I'm your host, Annie Bowles, and this is News du Jour. Good morning. I am Annie Bowles, and this is the News du Jour. Welcome back. If you're new here, I wanted to start off with a disclaimer that while we promise to be a calmer space to consume the news, that's not to say that bad stuff doesn't happen. And when it does, we're going to be here to tell you about it and acknowledge its seriousness. However, we believe there's a lot more than doom and gloom going on in the world, and we will report on a range of different topics from entertainment to business, to politics, to fashion and art, and so much more. Whatever the top 3 stories of the day are, that's what we're excited to tell you about. We're glad you're here. An additional announcement for this week, for those who are unaware, Sugar Free Media will be donating 100% of this week's earnings from the podcast to Black Lives Matter Oklahoma to support their important work here in our home state. Today we are starting off covering stories from the protest, both for our first and second stories, and then we will cover a press conference given by Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and just briefly touch on a Facebook story that is relevant as well. In case you haven't noticed, there is new news every minute of every day right now. In an effort to keep you up to date, I'm more or less going to be sharing specific stories from the protest for this first story. They're awful and they're hard to hear, but I wanted to tell you that up front. It is important to listen and hear these stories because just like the murder of George Floyd, they are real. Let's get started. In Austin, Texas, a 16-year-old boy was shot in the head with a rubber bullet. It hit him so hard that he collapsed, covered in blood, and suffered a traumatic brain injury and had to be rushed to emergency brain surgery. He was peacefully standing on a hill, unarmed, just standing there. The video footage from this is hard. From the video footage of this, it's hard to imagine how he could have been perceived as a threat at all. He is recovering from surgery now, but is still in a lot of pain. His name is Brad Levi Elia. For our next story, 2 students were driving home after grabbing a bite to eat for dinner in Atlanta. They were stopped by the police while stuck in traffic and were tased while still inside their car. The woman was screaming so loudly in pain, and the cop pulled her out by her arms onto the pavement. Another police officer then smashes the driver's side window with a baton and shatters it while the young man is still in the front seat. Then he reaches through the broken window and uses a stun gun to taser him. Again, meanwhile, he's still in the car. The police officer then dragged the young man out of the car, and he fell to the ground, fracturing his arm and needing 20 stitches in it as well. The same officer then appears to use zip wires to handcuff the young man. The 2 students wisely lawyered up and brought charges against the officers. 2 of the officers on the scene were fired immediately, and the other 4 are on desk duty. All 6 officers were charged. Their names were Tanaya Pilgrim and Messiah Young. Before we continue on with our episode, I wanted to give you a quick behind-the-scenes look at how I produce my podcast. So I actually use and love Anchor, a free tool for podcasters. It's everything you need to create, distribute, and make money from your podcast all in one place. And it has a matching app that makes tracking updates to your following super easy. You can download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm, that's ANCHOR.FM today to get started. For our next story, it's about a civil rights probe being conducted by the state of Minnesota. where this all began. Governor Tim Walz said at a press conference yesterday, quote, "This isn't about a broken system. This is about a system that is functioning absolutely as it was designed. Unfortunately, it was made to exclude some from it," end quote. I'm going to use a lot of quotations from him here because I want to make sure not to misquote him. So I want to quote him directly so that you guys can hear exactly what he plans to do in the state of Minnesota. So he also said, quote, "We are not going to establish peace on our streets by having the National Guard show up. We are not going to establish peace on our streets by keeping a curfew in place all the time. We will have peace on our streets when we address the systemic issues that caused the civil unrest in the first place," end quote. And then he said, quote, "You don't care what I say. You care what we do. So today, the Minnesota Department of Human Rights is filing a commissioner's charge of discrimination to launch a civil rights investigation into the Minneapolis Police Department. The investigation will review MPD's policies, procedures, and practices over the past 10 years to determine if the department is utilizing systemic discriminatory practices towards people of color. Minnesota has one of the strongest civil rights laws in the country. It is illegal here for someone to discriminate against someone else for their race. This is the first time we have launched an investigation into the systemic discriminatory practices of the largest police department in the state. It is also the only investigation surrounding the killing of George Floyd focused on the policies and practices implemented by the Minneapolis Police Department," end quote. He also claims that they will implement both immediate and long-term solutions to discrimination when and where they discover it within the department during their investigation. And for our last story, we're going to touch on Facebook and what's been going on their platform just very briefly, because dozens of Facebook employees have actually staged a virtual walkout to protest the company's inaction over President Trump's inaccurate and potentially violence-inducing Facebook posts. Zuckerberg said in response, quote, "I have been struggling all day with how to respond to the president's tweets and posts. Personally, I have a visceral negative reaction to this kind of divisive and inflammatory rhetoric, but I am responsible for reacting not just in my personal capacity, but as a leader of an institution committed to free expression." So we will wait and see what they do next. And that is the news du jour. Today, I'm going to leave you with this quote: "A failure to plan is a plan to fail." If you are wanting to make change, whether it's to yourself or to this system as a whole, or make change to the system as a whole by making change to yourself, make a plan, because a failure to plan is a plan to fail. If we don't, make sure that we are following through with actions that make sense for the outcome we want, we won't get the outcome we want. So just think about what plans you want to put in place during this week of reflection. And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on whatever podcast platform you use to listen. A rate and review would mean the world to us and help us continue to create the news du jour for free for you guys. I also wanted to note that for the next week, we will be halting all social media posts aside from resharing posts from people of color. We will continue on with the daily podcast as we feel it is important to keep you up to date with the most current news in a calm way. You can follow us, though, on social media under sugarfreemedia.co on Instagram, sugarfree_media on Twitter, and sugarfreemedia, all one word, on TikTok. Our music is by Joey Lavoie and Nicholas Foster. Our cover art is by Hannah Pierce Photography. Our Sugar Free Media logo is done by Catherine Jezik Designs. We appreciate you listening and look forward to telling you about the news tomorrow. broadcasting from